Welcome to the Archaeological Institute of America's Iowa Society lecture. This is a national speaker, Dr. Steve Ellis, and he today will be talking to us about the Roman retail revolution. But before I begin on that, I will note that this lecture is being recorded. And so, as you can probably tell, you can't unmute yourself or show your screen. We will allow that for question and answer afterwards. But before I let Steve take it away, I would like to introduce him. So Stephen Ellis is an assistant professor of classics at the University of Cincinnati and a Roman archaeologist who is actively involved in the archaeological research and publication of urban and sacred sites in Italy and Greece. In Italy, Stephen directs the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project, Porta Stabii, and co-directs the Pompeii Quadriporticus project. Very busy with just those two, but as if those two weren't enough, while in Greece, he is the co-director of the East Isthmia Archaeology project. A recipient of many international awards, including research grants and fellowships from National Geographic and the Loeb Classical Library Foundation. And with regular appearances on National Geographic Channel, Stephen will soon follow up his book on the making of Pompeii, studies in the history and urban development of an ancient town. Oh, he's an associate professor. I don't know why mine said he was an assistant. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So he will soon follow up his book on making of Pompeii, studies in the history and urban development of an ancient town, 2011, with an interdisciplinary publication that illustrates the role that non-elites played in the shaping of ancient cities, social habits, and customs in antiquity, and on retailing in the Roman world, which is what he was speaking on today. Stephen is internationally regarded as a pioneer in archaeological fieldwork, and his revolutionary use of iPads was singled out by Steve Jobs and profiled on Apple's website. So without further ado, I would like to let Steve take it away. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that he can share his.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Trusty. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's of course, great to be here giving an AIA lecture. I'd rather be here in terms of being in Iowa than here being in my office in Cincinnati. But these are the times that we're in right now. And as you mentioned before, it was disappointing to miss it last year. So we kicked the can down the road a little bit, but here we are now. I also want to take a moment just at the beginning to thanking the Archaeological Institute of America for making these kinds of lectures possible, is to give a nod also to Frida Renner, who's made all these amazing contributions to the Institute over the years and is supporting this lecture itself. What I'm hoping to do with my talk tonight, or today, whatever time it is, wherever you might be watching from, is to get into sort of the roots of looking at retailing in the making of Roman cities. And so generally my work has been kind of interested in looking at the social and the structural making of Roman cities. And that's really kind of where what the discussions I'll have coming up tonight kind of spring from. So what I wanted to do was to, at one sort of level, I want to look across the Mediterranean so far as we can. And so we'll be looking at some of these little dots on the map here. These are dots on the map of sites that I've gone and done kind of field surveys of Roman retail landscapes. And so on the one hand, sort of the data, the information, the influences that are coming in from across a sort of a broad span of the Roman world on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's also coming in from, let me show my, doesn't seem to be, here we go. On the other hand, it's also being informed by these excavations as well. So I'll spend a fair bit of time on both of these excavations run by the University of Cincinnati. The one I'll probably spend most time on will be the Pompeii excavations in the so-called Porta Stabia project, but we'll also go and have a look at Tharos as well, and see just how kind of these have been influencing the work and some of my ideas as well. I really can't go any further though without making a point. And indeed, if you take anything away from this presentation right now, please let it be this. And it's that all that follows is really based on a group of amazing people, really great teams that I've been lucky enough to work with. And so, I get to sit here now and act as a kind of a spokesperson for a lot of their work. And it's a real privilege to be able to do that. But I do hope you recognize that it's built on a lot of great work and a lot of great ideas and effort by a lot of some amazing people. So I want to get that sort of note in early. But what I want to do first is to kind of spend a bit of time in Pompeii, just to give a kind of a background to the two projects. And then we'll start looking at retailing spaces within these two sites and across the Roman world a bit more, broadly on the one hand, and also with a bit more detail on the other. Both projects, the first project we'll look at is the Pompeii project, which began in 2005. So it's the sort of the oldest of the two projects, been running for the most number of years, and so we know more about it, and we can do more with that data than we can with Pharos, which we'll see in a moment. To give you a kind of a sense of where we are in the city. For those of you who know the city, we are down in the southern part of the city, down near the so-called Porta Stabi. If we zoom in for a moment, kind of give us our bearings here. So we started working in this neighborhood in 2005 and spent several years, about 8 years or so, excavating these two town blocks. So it's two town blocks of houses and shops, restaurants, inns. That's certainly what they look like for 79 AD, but what we were hoping to do was to sort of go underneath the city of Pompeii and to go underneath these latest buildings and to sort of figure out how they got into the shape that they were in when they were destroyed in the first century. So we'll come back to sort of what the ramifications of that aspect are in a moment. Oh, hang on. All right, so we undertook excavations across the site. It was quite a large project. As I say, we spent about 8 years, and we spent from about 2005 to 2012, and I spent the years since then working on the publications, right? And I'm kind of pleased to say that the first of those that we have a 4-volume series that we're working on, and the first of those volumes is already with the readers right now. So on the one hand, it's and kind of at a glance, it's a large project with lots and lots of data, and then the point here is not to really sort of get lost in too much of the data, or really to even celebrate having so much data, because with archaeological projects in the 21st century, it's of course kind of easy to get carried away with just the creation of so much information and data. And it's all very good and well to get that, but it's really the achievement is what you can then do with that information. So that's what we'll try to sort of focus on tonight. But one of the things about having these excavations is that we've been able to sort of develop an idea of really what the site looked like, certainly by 79 CE. So I have this kind of reconstruction here, which I want to, here we go. So we've been able to take a site, run these excavations, and sort of essentially build up the architecture from how it's been kind of destroyed in 79 AD, and to kind of develop a kind of a reconstruction of how this very much kind of a retail landscape looked in 79 CE. And I want to make a point of looking at this one here for a moment. This is the work of the amazing Gareth Blaney, who is our, he's essentially been working on our illustrations and our reconstructions of the site, and maybe we can come back to this a little bit later on as well. There's a whole bunch of kind of Easter eggs in here, and if you go to there's a Twitter account for the project down the handles down here, where we sort of reveal some of those kind of little details. Even the cups here that's sitting on the table, for example, are the kinds of cups that were found in that very project, in that very property itself. So on the one hand, we've been able to kind of create a project where we can see what the site looks like, or create an idea of what the site looks like in 79, but really our greater interest was to sort of understand how did it get to the shape that it was in. So what are the sort of the episodic growth spurts over the years, over the centuries, that enabled a site to kind of develop over time and sort of think about the sort of the reasons why it develops, it changes, and it morphs over time. The other aim was to sort of look at not just singular buildings as well, but to come and to Pompeii and to look at sub-elite buildings, so-called sub-elite buildings, what we saw as being sub-elite buildings when we first began our work, and to kind of think about not just the developments of individual buildings, but to think about them as a neighborhood as well, to think about how they relate to each other socially, economically, historically, so on and so forth. I guess the other sort of main aim of this project was to, in spite of all of that data, well, because of all that data, it's really easy to kind of get stuck in the mud, as it were, of any singular trench or room or building. And so what we wanted to do was to sort of pull out from that, pull out from the incredible micro detail of looking at the tiniest fish scales, to the tiniest little pieces of cherry pip or grape seeds that you can see here on the bottom left, and to sort of pull out from that story and to develop not just a story of one trench or one room, or even of one property, but to sort of look at this landscape across the whole area of the Porta Stabia, and to kind of connect it as best as we could to this bigger picture of Pompeii itself. So I hope this kind of drone video comes through, or at least brings out an idea of just how kind of big and complex Pompeii itself is. But even that is sort of not enough for us. What we really want to be trying to do is to build a bigger picture of Pompeii, of not just a Pompeian excavation or Pompeian archaeology, but one that kind of connects to other areas, to other regions, and other places as insofar as we can, and insofar as we are capable of doing that kind of work. So to that end, I just want to move to the next part of this introduction, which is the Tharos project. So very, very quickly on this one, without spending too much time, the Tharos project was begun very recently in 2019. Tharos itself is a Punic Roman city in Sardinia, on the west coast of Sardinia. You can see the location of it here. And so we came here to sort of to kind of open up and to build out a bigger picture of what it means to excavate through a retail landscape. So the site itself is famed for its tombs, and there's a lot of archaeology being done on the tombs that sort of sit on the outskirts of the city at each end of the peninsula that we were just looking at. But the urban remains themselves have not had enough work done on them. So at the sort of most minimal end of the scale, we really want to sort of think about how did the city develop over time, but really because of our interest, we wanted to sort of zoom in on some of the retail landscape here. And so to that end, we're looking at two kind of different areas of the city. One that is what we call the Southern Shops, which is an area that had been excavated prior to our sort of arriving. As like lots of archaeological sites, this area was excavated in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so what we're able to do was to sort of come into this place and this space, work on the standing architecture with Eric Paler, and then to try to then go underneath it with the work of Sarah Wenner, who's sort of running the excavations of this part of the site here. Sort of go underground, as it were, kind of like what we're doing at Pompeii, and to try to help us to get an idea of that developmental process. But the other reason why we wanted to work in this area of the city is because it gave us a kind of a head start, because it had been cleared out of the debris that had covered it. On the one hand, and to kind of compare that data, that record, that story with another part of the city, which we can't really get at with Pompeii. So this may sound funny for the archaeologists in the audience who normally get sites like this, where you have sort of the overburden, you have the vegetation, you have a sort of an abandoned period and level of the city that has been sort of overgrown with vegetation over the years. That's actually really, really exciting for us, having come from Pompeii, because we missed that opportunity to be able to see that story of sort of essentially the economic downturn of this part of the site or the city itself, and its overall abandonment over the years. So we're also looking at a retail landscape up in this part of the city as well. And that is, a lot of it is actually kind of based on some really kind of basic markers, which are these threshold stones. You can see some of them up here, these shopfront entrances which give us something of a common denominator between Pompeii and Pharos, and indeed with a lot of sites in the Mediterranean as well. We'll see that this kind of marker of a doorway, basically the formation of a kind of a retail doorway, is essentially, it's an invention of pretty much the late 1st century BCE. And it's something that we find in some Roman cities and not in others. And so I might come back to that a little bit later and talk a bit about the ramifications of that. But by working in 2 different cities, but looking at the same kind of properties, so basically shops and different kinds of shops, we had an opportunity to start to, and I say start because we haven't been able to finish this job yet, because on the one hand, the Pompeii excavations, we had this full, rich story. We've excavated over 40 trenches over 8 years, 2 town blocks with about 20 different shop fronts for about 10 different big sort of building plots. For our work at Pharos, we only just began in 2019, and you can probably guess where this is going. We were kind of derailed, well, not kind of, we were certainly derailed by, of course, COVID in 2020. So that's kind of limited the extent to which we can sort of draw comparisons between the two. One thing that's interesting so far is that we're finding less sort of urban forms and urban features at Pharos compared to Pompeii itself. Is that something we're trying to sort of draw out and to flesh out a little bit more? There's certainly 2 very, very different cities. One's more of a town and one's more of a city. So the scale of them is quite different on the one hand, but on the other hand, they also have lots of similarities in them as well. So moving forward, what all of this is really sort of building up a picture of is a kind of a landscape at both Pompeii, but also Pharos, and indeed for a lot of these Roman cities, that is dominated by retail and retail spaces. And so if we think about the shop, the tavern, the taberna, the shop, whatever you want to call it, the commercial space, the retail space, when we think about them as a unit, they outnumber all other singular types of Roman buildings for any Roman city in which we find them, right? So we have them in abundance, we have them in great number. And we can say a lot about them if we care to, right? There's been a lot of sort of increased attention and more work being done on these kinds of spaces over the past couple of decades or so. So we're making sort of great inroads now into thinking about retail landscapes and to think about commercial space in Roman cities. What I've been trying to bring to that conversation is an interest in looking at retail landscapes kind of over time. And this is sort of what brings in the kind of the title for the talk today, which is the Roman retail revolutions, which is essentially a way of saying that on the one hand, when we look at a place like Pompeii, as you can see on the screen right now, we have a neighborhood dominated by retail and hospitality outlets, and that's true for 79 CE when we sort of the Pompeii that we walk through today. But it wasn't necessarily true for the history of Pompeii. And so what we've been trying to do is to sort of look at that development, that growth, and that story of retailing over time. So to that end, this brings us now to sort of the next phase of the talk, where I want to start in on thinking about retailing spaces kind of over time. And the retail revolutions that I'm speaking of here, there are basically not just one, but 3 of them. And so very, very generally, I don't want to speak about all of them in detail today. I'll speak about one of them, the second one, in a bit more detail than the other 2. Basically, the first is essentially the first spike in numbers of retail outlets that we see in Roman cities. That happens in about the 2nd century BCE. This is not at all to say that there aren't shops and aren't even shops in number prior to that period, but certainly where we can get the data, where we can get the actual information. The information is quite rare to get excavation and systematically excavated data on dates for these kinds of buildings. It starts to point into the 2nd century. And it makes sense too, because a lot of these developments are in fact piggybacking on or sort of integrated in with rather, basically urban developments that are happening in the Roman world at that time. A second related development, which we'll spend a bit more time on today, happens in the early imperial period, and we'll see how that is really about the beginning of the specialization of shop types And then we'll see another one happens in the early 2nd century CE, where things start to get a little bit more standardized, a little bit more regularized or homogenized over time. So to be able to do this, as I say, it's hard to get at the data, it's hard to get at the information, to be able to tell a story of retailing spaces over time, except for sort of getting into excavations. I'm showing you this horrible slide here. It's filled with too much kind of confusing information, but that's also part of the point of it, because it's actually our way of, through the excavation, sort of expressing this change over time. The archaeologists here will be, of course, familiar with these Harris matrices down on the top right and the bottom, which are basically just an opportunity to sort of demonstrate how all the bits and pieces that we dig through, all the different layers, all the different floors, all the different subfloors, all the different features that represent some kind of activity in the past, and usually a construction activity in the past, are essentially numbered and sort of organized in a sort of a stratigraphic and a kind of a chronological relationship. So on the one hand, that enables us enables me to kind of confuse you with this very, very busy slide. The image on the top left was basically that kind of story happening in a more of a spatial sense. And the real point is that we need to kind of make sense of this noise by kind of coordinating the data in a very kind of systematic way. We're able to ultimately start to recognize the relationships between the development of one shop and the development of a neighboring shop. We able to see the sort of the physical connections, and also the sort of the analogical or the social and the economic relationships between that might be happening over time. So this is what helped us to be able to sort of build that story and to start to identify the patterns of development. And so those patterns of development that really built up this picture of these Roman retail revolutions. That's why I show it to you, just to give us a sense of the value of this kind of excavation data, which we haven't been able to sort of generate prior to these projects. Moving sort of to flesh that out a little bit more, one of the interesting stories, I think probably one of the most interesting stories of the story of these shops and these bars and these taverns that we find in the Porta Stabia district, is that when we look through these spaces over time, we see them sort of changing over time, not just developing, but truly changing. So the activities that we see in this neighborhood really only appear, well, I should say, I'll rephrase that. The earliest evidence we get for activity in this neighborhood, even though we have buildings, we have constructions here from about the 6th century BCE, most of that information is really quite kind of scrappy and quite limited because it gets kind of destroyed by later constructions happening up over top of those buildings and sort of eating away at those remains. So the earliest evidence for actual activity happens in about the 3rd century. And it's when we start to see, well, here we actually get a ceramic kiln in the site. We actually get a couple of ceramic kilns in the site. And then over time, between, say, the 3rd century, leading right up into what we have here, phase 4, right up into the 1st century BCE, we see basically production activities. So this is not quite industrialized space, but it's certainly cottage production scale industries are dominating this entire neighborhood from about the 3rd century through to about the 1st century, the late 1st century BCE. We find here tanneries, or we find a tannery, I should say, in singular, and also multiple fish salting vats. So we know that they're salting fish in this neighborhood. And what's important about these kinds of activities is that we'll see them, or just a quick word on this fish salting, we can see the vats here that we have lining the street, going up and down the street here are basically the same, kind of morphologically the same as the kinds of fish salting vats that we find in Spain, Morocco, Portugal, etc. I should give a shout out here to Christopher Motz, who's just finished his PhD at Cincinnati on the knowledge networks behind sort of the movement of the ideas around and the sort of the technologies around this kind of industry as well. So so we have these fish salting vats, and we have them in number at our site. And we also have kind of the waste facilities for them as well. We find not just the vats where there's salting fish to ultimately produce not just salted fish, but also the fish sauces and the fish paste, garum, liquamen, that kind of product. Is that we find them in multiple different kinds of independent buildings or otherwise independent buildings or seemingly independent buildings. And then over time, they all seem to sort of go away. Well, they don't go away. They get basically filled in with debris and then replaced. And that all happens around about the same time. And it's a really important, oh, here's that soakaway. I should mention here these just some of the waste facilities that we get that are associated with the fish salting tanks. So the tanks don't typically have fish bones and fish scale in them. It's a very kind of clean process, but the waste facilities have that's kind of that proxy evidence, that sundry evidence. Moving forward though, what we find though that's most interesting is that these, I'll come back for a second, you can see it here. In fact, these vats get filled in, you can see it down the bottom here as well. They get filled in with debris, they lay in new floors, and they replace what was once a fish salting factory with basically new floors and new retail spaces. This is a really big change that we see. It's one of our most striking developments in the whole site that we have because we see actual true change to the use of space. And it may not sound like that big of a change. We go from workshops to shops, production spaces to retail, but it really is a different kind of streetscape that we start to see developing in these early years of the early imperial period. So the first years, more or less the first years of the first century CE. So it's a big change that we see happening at this time. And I think it's a really exciting change because we actually see it not just impacting our neighborhood, the Porta Stabia, but we actually see it reflected in other developments, again, tying back into this whole idea of the Roman retail revolutions across the Mediterranean at that time. We see another big boom in retail spaces in this early imperial period. And what really typifies this period of time is basically the arrival of a much more specialized retail landscape and a retail space. Essentially what we're getting at this time is the invention of the Roman bar counter. Basically, we don't get Roman bar counters until this time. When I say Roman bar counter, I mean, for the most part, I mean the masonry built bar counters that you can see on the screen here. Prior to this time, there would have been wooden setups, but they would have reflected a much more kind of temporary setup and kind of, in fact, reflected kind of an opportunity to sort of roll with the punches of the urban economic system. So when we see the arrival of a masonry counter, a fixed permanent point of sale, what we're seeing is we're seeing it coming with kind of a newfound kind of commitment and even confidence in a retail environment that we haven't seen before. What I find so interesting about that development is not just that it is the invention of specialized retail spaces. And I'll show you also these plans on the right-hand side here. These are basically showing you at this stage, we still get also kind of specialized shop forms with these counters too. So we get single dinky little one-room joints. We get one-room shops that are sort of built into much bigger houses. And we also get whole sort of outlets as well, big sort of restaurant kind of spaces associated with this kind of retailing activity in, I should say, food and drink. And it's important to make the point here that it's food and drink. So this specialized retail counter will typically have some kind of cooking facility built into it. And also, you can start to see them now. We'll see some better pictures in a moment of the vessels built into them as well for the storage of foods that were then being prepared for cooking and consumption. What's so fascinating, I think, though, about this sort of invention of the counter and this sort of specialized retail landscape that we're now seeing at this time is that it comes at the same time as another kind of important development at this time. And that's why I have these kind of bars and brothels. This is a really kind of interesting development that we're seeing in these early years, because it begins now in the early years of the first century CE, but it won't last forever. Now, this is, of course, not me saying that bars and brothels have a shelf life, right? There are still bars and brothels to this day, believe it or not. Of course there are, and there always have been, but what we're seeing here at this time is a new kind of urban condition. But by that I mean that we're seeing, and this kind of really is the magic of a place like Pompeii, in that it was destroyed in the 1st century CE, is that we get this urban condition in which we see a kind of an apex in urban innovation, or particularly in urban specialization and specialization of urban forms happening at this time. So the evidence of this is basically, in terms of the bars and the brothels, for example, is the fact that we have these bar counters now for the 1st century CE, but we won't see them forever. They won't last forever. And even the specialized, or even the brothel, is a similar kind of circumstance. If I just advance here for a moment. So Pompeii, we of course have this Pompeian sort of purpose-built brothel, and it gets a lot of interest by tourists who come and see the site, and it deserves a lot of interest from scholars as well. And certainly the best thing that's been written on it recently, if not so kind of forever, I would argue, is the book by Sarah Levin Richardson, a great book on this building, a very recent book. But what I would say is that's fascinating about it is that so much of the attention is given over to these small cubicles that we have here. We have, of course, the plan of it with the little cubicles and the sort of masonry benches inside. And of course, it has lots of graffiti and wall paintings and all the rest of it that sort of help to sort of identify this as a purpose-built brothel. But what's fascinating about it is not just that it's the only one of its type in Pompeii, but really rather it's the only one of its type that we get from the Roman world. And so it stands to reason that we should be asking more questions about why don't we find more buildings like this? And I think the reason why we don't find more of them like this is because this kind of hyper-specialized building that we get for retail on the one hand, and we're also getting now for brothels on the other, is something that won't last forever. Ultimately, what we'll see is that basically over time, once we get into the 2nd century, we're still seeing bar counters being built in the 2nd century, certainly going a little bit into the 3rd century as well. But otherwise, we find a significant drop-off in the construction of these masonry counters that so typify our imagination of the Pompeian retail landscape. So we find them in other places. Just coming back to the bar counters here for a moment, we find them in other places. We find them in Gaul, this one in Gaul at Olbia. There's terrible remains of this one at Seripola, just north of Rome. But basically, these are mostly associated with Pompeii and Herculaneum, so the 2 Vesuvian cities destroyed in the 1st century. And then it's really just Ostia that has about 33 of them at Ostia from the 2nd century, and not many that are built into the 3rd. So there's a strong drop-off in this kind of specialized retail form, and I think is quite interesting. What causes it is, I only want to sort of touch on it very briefly here. It's probably a topic for another day, but basically we see the advent of a new kind of city that comes out of the Rome, sort of the urbs nova in Rome. So this rebuilding of Rome in the late 1st century, following the fire in Rome and following Nero's building codes of how to sort of rebuild a city. And the necessity of rebuilding a city sort of en masse, and the mass production that went into doing that kind of created a new blueprint for a much more homogenized, regularized, standardized urban form. And so when we start to then look at other cities outside of Pompeii, we see a drop-off. We stop seeing them building bar counters, and we should find bar counters because we do. And the fact that we can find them in some places, but then we don't really find them in most other places, shows that it's not really an accident of their survival at Pompeii or their survival in other cities. It really is something that is going out of favor sort of over time. And I should say also that, come back to the brothel a bit too, this kind of architecture for the brothel, we should find patterns like this, small rooms, the masonry bed. If we're going to find these sort of all over the Roman world, we should easily find them, just as we can find some of the bar counters, or even just the shapes of other kinds of buildings at places like Pompeii, like an atrium house or something like this. So moving forward, I think this is really one of the gifts then of Pompeii, right? Is that it gives us, of course, it was a terrible circumstance for the Pompeians themselves, that the city is destroyed, their lives are ripped apart, and then what happens then is that, for us archaeologically, what we then get is a first century city that is otherwise not well represented in most other urban places. And a lot of Roman cities, of course, overlap with the first century. They're, of course, around during the first century, but we don't really have a good archaeological record for that layer in time. So that's really is sort of the gift of a place like Pompeii, is not just that it was destroyed, but really rather when that it was destroyed. I say gift is the wrong word, right, to use for this kind of thing. This brings me now to a next sort of stage I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the most recently discovered bar counter in Pompeii. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It was very, very splashy in media recently. And I think this is one of the reasons why this is such an interesting counter, because when we compare it to, just to give you a quick idea of what we're looking at here, we're looking at the new excavations in Pompeii. Basically up here in region 5 up here. This is the new excavations, which are aimed at sort of mitigating a lot of the damage and rain damage and water damage and landslide damage that was happening up in this part of the city, but of course have now given us a chance to sort of see a little glimpse of a couple of new buildings that have been basically rediscovered. They'd been looted a little bit in the past couple of hundred years or so, but now they've a great chance to have a newer, more modern excavation of these places. And what it helps us to see is just how unusual this new counter really is, not just in terms of its preservation. And clearly you can see here, when we look at counters throughout a place like Pompeii, which has the best evidence for them, more often than not, they survive like this on the top right here, where we've got basically just a little bit of masonry and just an inch or two of painted plaster that might survive on it. This one on the top left here, for those playing at home in Region 1, Insular 11, is sort of one of the better preserved counters, one of the more recently discovered counters too in Pompeii, only discovered about 50 or 60 years ago. So it sort of survives a better. But otherwise, we find very few. This is one of the best examples that we have of painted counters. So this gives you an idea of just how special something like this really is, just how well preserved it is. But it's also really special for us because it's unusual in and of itself. The shape of the counter is a little bit unusual, the sort of zigzag shape that it has. It's not a typical L shape that sits at the very, very front of the threshold. So there's actually room for people to sort of come in. You would think there'd be room for people to sort of move in off the street front and into the shop itself. Maybe even to look at some of these images we see here on the front here. The paintings on the counter itself. Interestingly enough, all these amphorae that may have been stacked above and fallen down, or were just actually stacked up against the counter, which is a fairly typical kind of thing, sort of kept you from sort of approaching the counter completely. But anyway, the point I want to make about this counter is that it's a very, very exciting new find for the city, and a lot of work. I'm very glad to be a part of these excavations. And in fact, I'm part of the publication process for this. Once I can sort of leave here, obviously I'm stuck here in Cincinnati, but I'm very sort of grateful to be with Massimo Osana, sort of working on the publications of this counter, and we're going to try to get some stuff out as soon as possible. It'll take a little while because there's a lot of people involved with not just the counter itself, but with the excavations of the broader building, and of course all the objects that are associated with the counter, and in fact with these vessels that are found that are sort of built inside the counter. Interestingly enough, it's not just an interesting counter for its shape, its design, its preservation of its paintings on it, but those storage vessels held in them really unusual, very practically unique examples of well, I should say, normally where food has been recovered from these vessels, it's been things like nuts, legumes, dried fruits like figs and things like that, because those vessels aren't well sealed, and they're not easy to clean out either. But the discovery in here yielded meats. So there's examples of duck bones, pig bones, goat, fish, shellfish. So it's a really quite extraordinary find. What we hope to do with this new find is to then compare that food data with the food data we've got back from our Porta Stabia excavations and from the Tharos excavations as well, eventually, once we can get sort of more of that work going. So we can actually kind of build a bigger picture of diet that might be associated, or even really rather the menu associated with these kind of retail outlets for the retail sale of food and drink. So what we're doing is basically we're planning on connecting, I say the data from the counter itself. And so for us at Porta Stabia, we didn't have any data from the counter itself, but we do have food remains and food scraps from the kitchens that was serving and providing those counters. And so from the kitchens, from the drains from those kitchens, we also from some of the soakaways that were associated with not just the garum production, but also with food production as well. These I should say, these soakaways are really kind of great. They are interesting in that we find them in Pompeii really just at a lower, earlier level. We rarely find them associated with 79 CE. And Catherine Baker, formerly of Cincinnati, now at Bryn Mawr, is doing some really good work on these kinds of basically waste receptacles. So they're reused amphorae. They puncture holes in them. They bury them into the ground, and that's how you can then sort of allow liquid waste to be drained away underneath your floorboards, basically. So the work we've been able to do so far with the food remains coming from the drains, the soakaways, the cesspits, the toilets, the latrines, has been really quite useful for us, because it's been able to create this kind of bioarchaeological record. As I say, we're trying to do it we're doing it for both sites. But as I say, we have most of our research so far, and the results so far is coming from material from Pompeii. Here we just showing you Dr. Michael McKinnon, who's working on both projects here. Dr. Angela Trentacosta and Jane Miller are working on this material so far, with Mark Robinson and Andy Fairbairn as well. And so what we've been able to do is to look at the seeds, the bones, the fish scale, the shell, all these kind of localized waste products in these different kinds of properties, and to try to recognize, our aim was to try to recognize any kind of socioeconomic differences between one property and the next. And interestingly, we started to see that too. So for example, this property, the red one in the further south, had a sort of a fairly standardized collection of minimal variety of fruits and vegetables and seeds and cereals. But when we went and looked at just a couple of doors up the street in this property up here, which was always a much more sort of seemingly entrepreneurial property, more changes, more developments, more growth. It seems to grow over time. We found that their diet, their menu, in fact, was of a much higher quality, and it had not just all the same kinds of meats and vegetables and cereals that we find in the other property, but it had a far greater variety of them. It had younger cuts of meat, and also had more flavorings. So the flavorings were quite critical. So everything from sesame to coriander to even peppercorns that are all sort of imported from as far away as maybe even India. So it's an important sort of opportunity for us to sort of look at not just the menu, not just the diet, and think about sort of trade and movement of goods and the sort of the cultural landscape that goes with eating, but also for us to start to think about what does this mean for measuring different kinds of status, different kinds of indicators of livelihood across this sort of micro landscape of two town blocks. So we started to do that, and we could see some changes and some differences on the one hand, and on the other hand, over time, we started to kind of reconsider what we were sort of thinking of being these kind of striking differences between one property and the next. For one thing, some of the foods were sort of showing up that was sort of more telling than flavorings, but sort of the more nutritious foods. So we were finding eggshell was really prevalent across all of the properties here. So we're getting a sense of, overall nutrition is really quite high in this neighborhood. But we also got a sense that we might have been looking a little bit too closely, just because well, all that data with Pompeii and all the sort of, it's all very kind of lineal and very kind of binary. We can look in one property and then in the next. And I think we started to get locked a little bit in that story of Pompeii. So Pompeii has so many standing walls and so many doorways and so many block doorways that you can easily sort of get lost or get overly committed to sort of seeing difference and distinction between one property and the next. And what we start to lose is sort of the neighborhood itself. And so what I mean here is what we're trying to do is to kind of blur those binary divisions between one property and the next. And some of the evidence that's helping us to do that, to reevaluate those distinctions, are those objects and features that are associated with infrastructure. And so we see cooking facilities, storage facilities, water facilities that are seemingly kind of shared. These are resources that are shared between one property and the next, indeed between properties that we might think are otherwise quite separated. So we're seeing here's an atrium house with a cooking facility inside the atrium that's serving the bar counter out the front. On the top left here, we have these wine amphoras. This is pretty common, that are being stored not just above a bar counter and above a tavern, but stored in a house that is above that space. And we find sort of lots of evidence for houses, quite elite houses, using their spaces for storage for the retail spaces out in front. And a lot of this is really trying to sort of, as I say, kind of blur those divisions. I think for a long time, because there's so much great data at Pompeii, it's easy to get lost in the measurements, in the distinctions, in the distances between one thing and the next, because it's all measurable, it's all quantifiable. And I've done that myself for most of my career, but just now sort of reaching a point where I'm trying to sort of blur those distinctions a bit more and kind of complicate the data a bit more. It's all, just to sort of head towards the end of this talk, it's all sort of on the back of also revisiting how we think about neighborhoods and how we think about status across Roman cities as well. And so, you know, a lot of my work on bar counters and on shops and retail spaces has had this sort of shadow of the past, particularly the 20th century, sort of looming over it, because most of the work that scholars have done is to try to sort of separate the haves from the have-nots, the elites from the so-called sub-elites, or have we sort of understand or misunderstand sub-elite and elite lives. And so we find this distinction really pinned onto sort of large houses that have shops and bars sort of stuck into the front of them. So zooming in here, we have passages like this where we see a shop inside a house, and we read that the resident of a modern city has seen fine old homes gradually transformed into rooming houses and places of business, immediately recognizes a similar deterioration. These are my italics here. Deterioration in residence neighborhoods taking place in Pompeii. This kind of landscape of separation, division, keeping people into different parts of the city. We see it also, my emphasis in these, again, with defacement. So shops defaced the simple and severe architectural forms, and you can read, I won't read through all of these themselves, other than to sort of flag that these are passages that are sort of very dominant in the 20th century scholarship of Pompeii, even creeping into the 21st century scholarship. But things are just starting to change in the last handful of years. But we still read about in this bottom one that it's disturbing, right? That the juxtaposition of humble commercial structures and sumptuous private buildings of the elite may appear disturbing to the modern viewer. So what I'm really trying to do with some of this work, not just with the food that we're looking at and sort of thinking about diets and menus and the sharing of resources between these kinds of properties in a neighborhood, is to really think about sort of the bigger picture of urban investment and about who owns these places, how do they operate, and who operates within those properties as well. And so for a long time, there was this idea of kind of separation of classes and of status groups. And then that sort of got revisited in recent years, where we've been starting to sort of see that profit has played a really important part. And so in all of these other large apartment buildings, or even some of the largest houses, so say the House of the Faun, where we get all these shops lining in the front of the House of the Faun, we start see this idea of the welcoming of profit. And it's even written in mosaic, salve lucru, the welcoming of profit into these buildings. But I think more than profit, we need also to be thinking and complicating this kind of almost anachronistic picture of profit. So this is not to take anything away from the value of money and the value of profit in the investment in these kinds of buildings and in sort of the establishment of different kinds of classes of people across the city, but to think about how patronage and power plays out in some of these properties as well. And so I think here we have an opportunity moving forward to kind of complicate these otherwise quite simplistic visions of shops and houses, rich and poor, elite and sub-elite, and to kind of develop a more interesting socioeconomic model that doesn't just see the sort of reception of sort of money and profit, but recognizes the value of patronage and power dynamics between elites and sub-elites and the creation of opportunities, whether it's through sharing of resources, whether it's through the creation of real estate and the creation of business opportunities. We're starting to now develop a better idea, I think, of a more integrated urban system that comes with looking at these kinds of properties. So I think the complication is a difficult one to sort of clarify at this point. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but I think one of the sort of the advantages of it will be to kind of move beyond these banalities that we have that have been sort of crept in with this idea of retail spaces and shops and taverns being a part of sort of so-called everyday life, and to recognize some of the many ways in which retail spaces were kind of woven into a more integrated, more complex picture of what was the Roman city. All right, I've reached the end of my time here, and so it's necessary to just give one sort of a final thank. I want to thank all the people on here, but clearly with two projects that have sort of lent a lot of information to what we've seen tonight, I want to sort of separate those out a little bit and give thanks to all those involved, and also to give thanks to everyone who's sort of here right now, no matter what time it is, wherever you are. I know some people are tuning in from quite late at night in different places. So I appreciate your interest, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, if you can do a virtual round of applause in the reactions button, you should be able to do that. Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. It was a wonderful talk. We will definitely, if you have time for a Q&A, do some questions. Would that be all right?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to.
Great. But before we do Q&A, I do want to say that if you are a member of the Iowa Society, the Central Indiana Society, or the Western Illinois Society, the three of us have teamed up to do a Meet the Speaker. And so Dr. Ellis has been very kind in volunteering his time to do a Meet the Speaker from 7 to 8 o'clock. You just check your email. There should be a link for that. We've already got some people registered for it, so that'll be a wonderful time. But if you have a question for Dr. Ellis, please, you can either raise your digital hand. In the reactions, you can find the raise hand button, or you can just say in chat your question either directly to me or just say question please, like Paul Scott has, and then I will unmute you or ask you to unmute. So Paul, you did it first. Here you go. You are unmuted, my friend.
Well done, Stephen. Thank you. I was quite impressed. And I want to come and visit both your sites. So another time.
Paul.
Okay. But my question is, do you have any evidence for a change in traffic patterns up your street? Or is there any way to gauge that there were more people of the foot traffic nature? I'm looking for why all of a sudden these counters appear.
Right. Yeah. Great question. In terms of the traffic, there's two kinds of traffic, right? There's foot traffic, and of course there's carted wheeled traffic. And I'd have to call on my dear colleague Eric Palo, who may be around. I'm not too sure. He'd have a better answer for the wheel traffic. In terms of pedestrian traffic, we have evidence for a response to movement of traffic in certain directions more than in other directions. And so I did a study years and years ago where I looked at Pompeii, particularly for Pompeii, it doesn't work in other kinds of cities, and I can tell you the reasons why in a moment. But Pompeii, when we get these counters, they get a choice as to what side of the threshold, what side of the frontage they want to put that counter on, because they haven't yet developed a mass-produced threshold stone, which they will do later on in the 2nd century, which means you're only entering on the right-hand side, which means your counter has to be on the left-hand side. That's the model we get for a place like Ostia, which has all these 2nd century counters. But in Pompeii, we have these, they're all 1st century counters, and they're putting them all over the place. So there's 164 counters, and there's something like 54 or 55%, I can't remember the details, I have to check in my book, of where they're putting them on one side or the other. It's pretty much split. And that split seems to be responding to traffic patterns. So we can see patterns moving in certain parts of the city. We can see them going in certain directions over others, but it's hard to see a kind of change over time in pedestrian traffic. I think we can anticipate one. I think you're right in that there's probably an uptake in the comings and goings of people that's sort of related to this retail landscape that really develops in the 1st century. So I think that in the sort of early imperial period, we're seeing more people coming into the city. I think we're seeing a different kind of city, and that might impact the counters as well. But it's hard to see the sort of the chicken for the egg in that kind of model.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Great. Any other questions? Again, you can either raise your digital hand, or you can put that in chat or send it to us. Antonio, go ahead.
Hi, I am actually an interloper from Duke University, where I am a graduate student. But I suppose one of the positive aspects of the COVID times is that I have the opportunity to do all the virtual lectures I'd like to sit in on. But thank you very much, Professor Ellis, for that.
You're very welcome.
Very, very intriguing and interesting talk. I happen to work at Volci with Professor Maurizio Forte, and I saw that you had a photo of the Domus of the Cryptoporticus there from Volci, and it got me thinking that right down the street from the Domus is another structure that is the so-called House of the Fishermen, which is much smaller, but is also based around a frontage with a taberna or store located in it. But it's much smaller and appears to be, of a much less like elite status, I guess, just based purely on the superficial aspects of its construction. But it only is 2 blocks down the street from the Domus of the Cryptoporticus, but it is 2 blocks in the opposite direction from the Forum, upon which the Domus of the Cryptoporticus is basically located, catty corner to that. And do you think that there are still some elite distinctions in this retail revolution? Is that also something we might be seeing in the frescoes that recently were found at the taberna at Pompeii versus some of the ones in your neighborhood?
Yeah, fantastic. I think definitely. I think there's there's some great work that was done on sort of luxury shops as well. And so the work of Claire Holleran has been doing some great stuff on looking at shops in Rome. Andrew Wallace Hadrill has a great chapter on this in his 2007 or 8 book, The Cultural Revolution. Basically looking at sort of the rise of luxury shops, particularly also in the 1st century as well. And so the point there is that, I think retailing spaces, we get big big shops, we get small shops, we get rich, poor, and I think we get the whole sort of gamut of the socioeconomic circumstance, and that's probably going to change over time. It's probably going to increase over time in terms of the availability of different kinds of goods and services, etc., or particularly goods coming into these Roman cities. So I think what you're looking at there probably certainly is just a good old-fashioned socioeconomic distinction between one shop and the next, for sure.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we also have one in chat from Kate Roby. She asks, the older tannery and fish processing in your area that precedes the shop levels, they look to be adjacent to public spaces. Were those super stinky businesses eliminated and built over because the building of public spaces next door?
Good question. I don't think so. I don't think that's why in terms of the dating of them, they coexist with the big public spaces next door. So the Odeon is a first century building. The Quadriporticus behind that is earlier still, into the 2nd century. So those big public buildings are there. I think there's a distinction though between fish salting and between the tannery itself. And Chris Motz is here. He could correct me where I go wrong here. But it seems as though the tannery itself is certainly kept back. And yeah, that really is there's no way of seeing it other than being a very, very stinky kind of business. And interestingly enough, it's sort of tucked back in the back of that property. What happens is that when it is back there, it's also the doorway into that room when it's operating as a tannery is completely closed off. You can't see it from the street. When they come along in the 1st century and replace that tannery, or basically fill it in, they fill in the tannery, they put a nice new cement floor on, and they probably make that a little dining space. They actually open up a new doorway that you can now see into that space from the street, way out the front. So there's big changes that are happening, where once they were tanning hides up there, there's now people, it's right very, very close to a triclinium from a dining space. The fish salting itself, the question there is the extent to which that smell would sort of, it probably wasn't as bad as the tannery, and it may be noticeable. I think, basically, the more people I speak to about it, the more range of answers I get. Some people think, yeah, these were terrible things, and they were certainly litigated against because of moving outside the city at a later stage. But at this stage, they could also serve as almost an advertisement as well. They are at the front of the property. They have covers over that would have had little sort of little coverings on top of them. On the one hand, to keep some of the smells in. On the one hand, on the other hand, to sort of open it up and to aerate things as well. So I don't know. I think there's two different circumstances between the tannery and the fish salting. But they coexist with all those big fancy public buildings, and so I'm not sure it's those that make them go away.
Maybe they had tougher noses than we do today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot to be said about that too. That there's a different kind of expectation for smell in an ancient city.
Yeah, definitely. Martha has a question. Let me unmute you. Go ahead, Martha.
Let's see. How do I unmute? Oh, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. I would thank you for this talk. It's very interesting. I'm teaching a class on the Roman Revolution, the Roman history, and I'm delighted that I'll be able to bring in aspects of the revolution in retail, along with the Roman cement and Roman upheavals. But what I was wondering is there a relationship at all to the Olynthus with the Hippodamian grid plan and the organization of any of these cities?
I don't think so. I'm not sure if there is a relationship between that far or going that far in terms of the grid system. It's not my speciality looking at grid systems, but I know that those who do look at it recognize that there's a sort of there's this idea, on the one hand, there's this idea that Hippodamus Miletus is sort of designing this and then creating this sort of model of a gridded city. But on the other hand, we see it sort of developing independently in lots of different places. And so I think when we look at the regularized gridded streets of Pompeii, I think it has its own impetus for its design and its construction. I'm not sure if it spreads that far to looking that far east for a sort of a model. I'm glad to hear you're teaching the Roman Revolution. It's a great topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, Steve. We have one we'll do this as our last question. but this is from a name that sounds very familiar after your talk. Gareth Blaney asks, graffiti and political sloganeering in Pompeii is ubiquitous, but what about the signage or advertising connected to retail? Is there any evidence of this?
Not enough evidence for it, alas. We just don't get as many signs as we would want to see and expect to see, maybe. The extent to which that is an accident of survival, I'm not so sure, because when we think of what survives at Pompeii, it's very easy to get kind of caught up with this idea that Pompeii is this perfect time capsule, and what we find represents sort of the city itself. We might find one or two things here and one or two things there, and then we sort of assume that we're going to find them all over the place. The example I'm thinking of here is not for shop signs, but instead for rental advertisements. We really only have a couple of rental advertisements. And those couple of rental advertisements have been used to sort of create this entire model of the rental business at Pompeii. And the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of Pompeii that has surviving plaster that doesn't have any evidence whatsoever for these kinds of things, or just not enough supporting evidence for either rental notices on the one hand or shop signs on the other. We may just be misreading things. There's a couple of signs here and there. There's the Shop of the Phoenix, for example. But though we have them, they are conspicuous by their absence, I would say. Like I guess my answer would be, for me, the glass is half empty rather than half full in terms of the number of shop signs we have for Pompeii. We have some, but I don't think we have enough to see it as a big system. Thanks, Gareth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. We'll give you about 20 minutes to relax and refresh before we go to our Meet the Speaker. So for those of you that have that link, that are members of the Iowa, Central Indiana, and Western Illinois societies, we will see you there. For all the rest of us, please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Ellis for such an engaging and interesting talk. Thank you so much.